Welcome and thanks for joining us for our daily Bible study. We call it Two Steps Forward. My name is James and this is my wife Adrienne, and we are up to episode 221, and today we are closing out the book of 1 Samuel. So 1 Samuel 31. Anything you want to say as we close out Samuel here today?
I don't think so. Are we?
What are we doing next?
Yeah.
Hebrews. No. We're probably going to take a week off next week. It's your boards. No, 1 week. It's your boards. Two, we try to do that after we finish each book. Just it gives us a little bit of a break. Gives me a little more chance to prep the next book. We might do, I know we've worshiped through it all summer, but because it's fresh on the brain and I have so many thoughts about it, Ephesians, we might do 3 weeks on that. You can look a little bit more excited about it. But thank you. And then I think we might jump back into 2 Samuel because it's a natural place to finish up with, where does this leave David now as the king of Israel? So, but we'll see. But for now, we're going to finish up 1 Samuel with chapter 31. Read through your copy at home. Here's my personal summary of 1 Samuel 31. The Philistines were in hot pursuit of Saul and his men. They killed 3 of his sons, including Jonathan, at Mount Gilboa. Saul himself was wounded and asked his servants to finish it for him. And knowing the torture that and for that matter the shame, if he fell into the hands of his enemies, he was afraid of what they were going to do to him. His servant refused to kill him though, and so Saul fell on his own sword. And his servant then in sadness and terror did the same. When the Israelites found out about all this, they fled, and the Philistines occupied their towns. The Philistines went the next day to strip the bodies of the valuables and took Saul's head and his armor. And his armor was placed in the temple of the Ashtoreths, and they set up his body as a trophy at a city called Beth-shan. The Israelites from Jabesh-Gilead went and found the rest of the Israelite bodies in the middle of the night. They took them, they burned them, and they buried them, and then they fasted for 7 days. And that's 1 Samuel 31, and 1 Samuel ending on kind of a tragic note. Any initial thoughts about that? Okay. So devotional thoughts for the day then. Number 1, Saul's tragic end. It seems kind of appropriate, unfortunately, I guess. After abandoning God repeatedly throughout his life, Saul is abandoned by God. He had to witness his 3 sons die in battle as he's running from the enemy, and his final words indicate what Saul's real concern in life was. He says, I'm terrified that my enemies are going to get a hold of my body and abuse me and embarrass me. In other words, Saul's always been scared at what other humans might do to him. He's never been actually fearful of what God would do to him. That's his he always fears other humans. Remember at his inauguration, he's hiding amongst baggage. And then he's got this whole insecurity over David and David's successes and people singing about David, how what a great warrior he was in contrast to Saul. And he's constantly has this perception of his legacy. And right up to the end here, what if they get my body and humiliate me and stuff like that? He only really ever had the externals of a leader. He's taller than everybody. He's handsome. He looks like a king. But there's again kind of a metaphor in all this. He never actually repented, so far as we can tell, genuinely repented before God. He never really had a fear of God. Consequently, so far as we can tell, Saul right here dies as an unbeliever, and he faces something much worse than falling into the hands of human adversaries. So if we just examine, for instance, Saul's fears, what do you think a person's fears say about what's really in their heart, what they really believe? So if you took somebody's worst fears, I think if you're a believer, the worst fears you have is that you'd be separated from God, But that, generally speaking, isn't what people fear the most, even if they are a Christian. So what do you think fears in general tell about you?
Yeah, I guess what you're actually concerned with. Yeah, I guess I don't have like if you're asking me for like an example.
Right. So, one of the ways I often talk about it is put it in terms of idolatry. Like, so I'm not afraid that people are going to call me a bad singer. I'm not a great singer. I'm not a terrible singer. But if somebody said, "Oh, you kind of got a lousy voice," that wouldn't hurt my feelings.
Yeah.
I'm not afraid of it because I don't find my identity in it.
So this is actually what I was thinking, but I'm hesitant to say it because first of all, I don't follow like news at all. I don't know anything that's going on out there outside of my own little anesthesia world.
Yeah.
But I was watching, before the Olympics, I was watching a 60 Minutes interview with Simone Biles.
Yeah.
And she's won however many, she's like the best gymnast of all time.
Yeah.
And I was surprised, she's 23, which is old for a gymnast.
In gymnastics.
And the interviewer specifically asked her, like, why are you competing again at 23? Like, you have a higher likelihood of getting hurt. Like, why not just go out on top? And she said, well, I still think I can do it. I still think I have, like, gifts to share, and, like, this is my calling, and, like, this is what I do, and as long as I'm still physically able to do it. And I was like, that's interesting. And then in the Olympics, and again, I don't know what happened. I'm not saying it wasn't mental health, but when I heard she had performed poorly in her first event and then just left the team, my first thought was, like, yep, now she is understanding what the interviewer was asking her, and thought, why would I go out like having lost at my last Olympics? Why
looking
wouldn't
less than the best?
That's what I originally thought. Like that was my first like sinful flush. Is like, yep, that makes sense. I too, if I wasn't doing well, would want to pull out and be like, nope, I am going to go out on top.
Yeah.
Like, forget this. I'm not saying that's what happened, because I know she had made a statement saying like she was suffering from mental health issues,
but it's all related. It's like, okay, it's mental health issues, but what's the cause of the mental health issue? It's probably panic about, I mean, I don't know this for sure, but it might be panic about, okay, my legacy, if I don't get a goal, this is how people are going to remember me as a failure rather than all the many successes. And so I don't think it's like even one or the other. I think, and really for a lot of athletes, I think that's the way. I think I just heard somebody say something the other day that was in the NFL. So in football, they said people don't retire from the NFL. The NFL retires you. In other words, it spits you out and tells you you're no longer good enough.
Yeah.
And there's for a lot of guys, I think they just play because of the fear of, like,
what am I without it?
Yeah. So I think and that's honestly, you could translate that over to any career and anything you do, whether it's gymnastics, Olympic gymnast, or... I
was honestly surprised. Like, I think this just goes to show, like, he didn't place his identity in his work, but as much and as hard as your dad worked, I was very surprised that your dad wanted to retire at 65, which I'm sure if you asked him, he would be so thankful he did, because he had, like, 7 years to hang out with your mom and play golf and of retirement that he wouldn't have had if he worked till 70 or... But I can see, like, I could see maybe it being like an issue for you, like not wanting to retire, because this has been my identity for 30 some years.
I think for a lot of men and women, it is. They like don't know who they are. It's you identity becomes so much what you do, because that's the world. When the world doesn't understand an imputed identity, like the righteousness of Christ is imputed upon you, and that makes you who you are, a redeemed child of God. The only way the world can figure out an identity is by what you do then, or who you're connected to. And so if it's wrapped up in what you do, the moment you stop doing that, you are, like, by definition, nobody. And people are so afraid of that it's terrifying. So that fear of, like, legacy, that thing of, like, anytime people want something named after them, I don't want to be overly judgy about it, but it's so interesting to me. Like, I need to have my name on that thing so that people will remember me.
Well, I mean, that could be some of it. Sometimes I think, though, like, if you pass away, someone could look back and say, like, oh, they gave a lot of money to this cause. Like, this must have been important to them. Like, this is what they stood for.
Yeah, I still don't know that that's necessarily right.
Oh,
maybe.
You know.
I don't know that it's wrong either. I mean, I'm not saying that. I'm saying I think if I was naming something, after myself, that I think it would be for reasons of legacy.
Well, when we sponsored the plank on the ark that was built on Answers in Genesis, I accidentally put...
Not accidentally.
Okay, we got so our names are listed as Pastor and Adrian Hine, and you were upset because you're like, my name's not Pastor.
Yeah.
No one will know it was me. You didn't say that. You just said, that's not my name.
I did say that's not my name. And even that was like, I don't know that was the whatever, but it was.
It's not like it's listed on.
I'm not getting credit for whatever.
You're just annoyed because your name's not Pastor.
Well, I don't know. I don't know exactly what it was, but I'm sure it wasn't healthy. Whatever I was feeling at that moment. But Saul we're always afraid of the stuff that actually doesn't, like the flesh stuff that doesn't actually matter. And Saul is proving it across the finish line when he dies. Like all he can think about is like, well, what are people going to think of me, or whatever. And here he is, impenitent, and going to have to stand at before an almighty God. And the only thing he can think of is how is he going to be embarrassed before his people? It's just kind of pathetic, and hopefully a lesson. Devotional thought number 2. A word about suicide. Okay, so we do know that Saul was severely wounded from battle, so it's possible that he would die eventually from this wound anyways, but he falls on his sword. He first asks his armor bearer to kill him. It's like, I'm going to die, just finish me off. His armor bearer, much like like David, has some kind of concept and respect for like the Lord's anointed. He's like, I can't do that. And so Saul's like, fine, I'll do it myself. And so it's a suicide of sorts. It's probably the second most famous suicide in the Bible, Judas Iscariot being the first. And interestingly, so Judas Iscariot in Acts 1, we're told that he ended his life and he went to the place that he belonged, which very clearly indication of like hell and separation from God. And on the basis of these two accounts, then, for a long, long time, a lot of the Christian world perceived suicide as an automatic, like, sentence to hell. And I think that's, unfortunate in a variety of different ways. Not that we shouldn't be, obviously hesitant about something like suicide as Christians, but knowing what we know about things like brain chemistry and mental health, and for that matter, even what actually sends somebody to hell. People don't go to hell because of any sins that they commit. And if somebody's, sinning in some way, shape, or form, let's say they have anger in their mind when they die. Let's say they're in a car accident or something like that. But just because they have sin at that moment doesn't mean that they're automatically bound to hell. People only go to hell, only get separated from God because they have rejected the grace of Jesus Christ and are impenitent of their sins. And therefore, that whole idea that if somebody commits suicide, that's their hell sentence, I think we've kind of turned a corner in thinking that way. Obviously, suicide would indicate a low faith and like a hopelessness, but it doesn't indicate necessarily no faith. It could be somebody in a very low moment that is doing something that's not an expression of faith, but doesn't mean they're impenitent and rejecting the grace of Jesus Christ. And so I think it's important to, again, reshape the way we think about that and the way we talk about it as Christians too. Do you think there's any general perceptions out there of Christians about suicide?
So if there's a war or something and I'm captured, and I know I'm going to be held as a prisoner of war, and who knows what's going to happen to me, can I kill myself to prevent whatever?
So kind of like what Saul's doing here then.
Yeah. Or is that like a lack of trust in God that, there's been many Christians over a long period of time that have been raped, martyred, whatever.
Yeah.
So it's not like God always will pull you from that situation.
Right. Yeah.
Wasn't one of the disciples crucified upside down?
Yeah. Peter.
I feel like I'd rather be crucified than raped, to be honest. If I knew that I was going to be sexually assaulted, and I kill myself,
there's a level of trauma that is worse than
is that
for sure.
acceptable?
Yeah. I think it's such it's a good question. I think it's such an individual case that, God is looking at that and saying, okay, they're stuck in a really difficult decision. So, for instance, even in things like in war times, it's such a perversion of humanity that what we choose to do in those moments. I'm not saying we have carte blanche to do whatever, but if our hearts are pure and we're fighting for the right cause, if we do I think God would hold against somebody the whatever those are called, not cyanide, the pills that are that end it, kind of thing. I don't think there's an issue with that. I think a general rule would be, however, that until God takes you, don't take it prematurely. So I'm trying to think of a couple examples.
What if I'm suffering from irretractable cancer pain?
Yeah. So there are Christian martyrs that would have, you think about the history of the Christian church, martyrs that would have had a chance to end it themselves, but instead ended up in even publicly humiliating. So Dietrich Bonhoeffer would be one in the 20th century, the German pastor who refused to not speak out against the Nazi regime and the treatment of the Jews. Could he theoretically have done something where he killed himself before he got publicly executed? Yeah, he probably could have. The early Christian martyrs like a James or a Peter or the other disciples, could they have ended their own life behind closed doors and saved themselves the public humiliation? So, for instance, Jesus, so far as we know, was probably crucified naked on the cross. Maybe that was the same thing with Peter. If Peter said okay, to somebody else, a guard, will you just end it for me right now? But he doesn't do that. He sees it to the end, even if it's embarrassing, even if it's whatever. And I think generally speaking, that's probably the right way to go. So, all right, devotional thought number 3 then. That was a bright and shiny note to talk through. Devotional thought 3, one bright spot. So there is an interesting high note that 1 Samuel sort of ends on. The men of Jabesh Gilead, the bodies of Saul and his sons being hung publicly on the outer walls of the fortress city of Bethshan, which is about 12 miles or so south of the Sea of Galilee. The men of Jabesh Gilead are no, we're not going to let that happen. That's too embarrassing. That's too, humiliating. So these men from Jabesh Gilead march during the middle of the night at great personal risk for themselves to rescue the bodies, cremate those bodies, and bury them. And the question then is, okay, why the men of Jabesh Gilead? And this actually is an interesting callback in the book of 1 Samuel. Because if you think all the way back to the beginning of Saul's reign, so 1 Samuel 11, Saul is not only anointed, but publicly inaugurated as the king, but he's hiding in the baggage, and everyone's are we sure we want this guy as a king? Shortly after that, one of the next stories we're told is that Saul is working out in the fields. He comes in because he hears some commotion, and he hears that Jabesh Gilead is getting attacked. And so what Saul does at that point is he gets the troops together, and he leads Israel's forces in battle against the Ammonites. And up until that point, many were on the fence about Saul's leadership, but because he acted in faith and he acted courageously, everybody is okay, yeah, Saul's our guy now. And if you remember, Samuel actually kind of seizes the moment, and he says, yep, remember, God appointed him, and you guys were little lackluster in your enthusiasm. So he commissions a worship service in Gilgal. They go and thank God for appointing Saul as king of Israel. And Saul's victory in Jabesh Gilead is arguably the most pure, faithful thing at the very beginning of his kingship. It's arguably the purest thing that he does in his entire reign. And the men of this city are still grateful for it 20 years later, that when Saul and his troops fall, they're nope, he was good to us. We can't let him be disgraced in this way. And so they go and risk their own lives and get his body back and give it a proper burial. And it's kind of this cool, the stuff that you do that helps people in hard times, they remember. And so in a life filled with so many mistakes and so much hardship, people do in fact remember the kind and brave acts that are done on their behalf. And so I just thought it was worth thinking about that, is there any specific incidents or people in your life that you're like, they were just unusually, undeservedly kind and good to me? Or one act where somebody was like, I can't believe that they didn't even know me, or they didn't even whatever, but they were just good to me.
Yeah. So last night after church, we went out with some people, and one of the guys is going off to seminary in St. Louis. And I asked him, like, is that the only option? And he said, oh, there's one in St. Louis and one in Fort Wayne. And he said, but when I was in like junior high, maybe, he said, I met the maybe director from the St. Louis one. And he said, I don't necessarily think he was like trying to recruit me, but he like showed an interest in me. And when he would come through town, we would like stop and get coffee and talk about like his ministry and like as a teenager. And he said he just invested in me like as a person. He said, so like it was no question to me then like which one I would go to. And I was like, that's a really interesting reason, even though like this one is closer to your girlfriend, closer to home, closer to whatever, but someone personally invested in you and showed you like this is the environment here.
Yeah.
I also feel like the pastor who took me through adult instruction, like I look back and I'm like, oh, I can't believe I was so like not demanded, but like took up, I feel like a lot of his time. And maybe it wasn't as much as I thought, but like I had so many questions going through adult instruction. And then like I remember meeting with him like personally to talk through certain things. And then he did our premarital counseling. And then this is so dumb of me. So we got married on a Sunday. And I asked him if he would do our wedding, and he said he would. And then I'm like, well, we'll pay for you to stay where we're getting married. And he was like, well, I kind of have like church on Sunday morning. So I'm not, and I'm like, I didn't even think about that. Like just how annoying. I took up his entire weekend. And then he broke his leg and he couldn't do the wedding, and he still came to the wedding.
Yeah.
Like 3 hours away.
Yeah.
Or 2 hours away or whatever. And so I think back on it and I'm like, man, he was extraordinarily kind to someone who was very annoying, and then who joined his church and was only a member of his church for like 9 months before I ended up moving to like getting married and moving. You know, it's not even like he got any long-term investment out of me.
Yeah.
And hopefully he gets a big reward in heaven for dealing with me.
It's an interesting thing to think about because, I mean, as a pastor, too, when you think about, I often talk about and think about, like, size dynamics. But, like, I can't, like, so if we had a congregation of 1,000 people or whatever, I can't have a relationship with 1,000 people. So, like, we could have other pastors, obviously, and people can have relationships with one another. But I think the concept of, irrespective of sermons or music or anything like that, it's like people who invest in you and care about you and pray for you and encourage you, and like at the end of the day, those who, you know, hold you accountable to the Bible and encourage you with the Bible and invest in you as a person. They love God's word and they love you as God's people. Like that's, you know, what church really is. And you know, just those types of relationships again and again and again, I'm just constantly reminded of certain things of, you know, people that God brings into our lives. That's a way better example. Those are both way better examples. I was thinking of my Aunt Sue, who would always buy me action figures on my birthday and Christmas and Easter. And I was always... I still have the action figures, and it was like it was just so simple. Maybe, I mean, you could say you're buying somebody's affection, I suppose, but it was probably not a big deal to her. But like for me, it was somebody who thought regularly of me and gave me something that they knew I really liked. And, you know, I still just have this like affection for that and for her for that. But I mean, there's other people along the way too. I think of you know, a coach in high school who would go out of his way, not just with me, with a lot of guys, go out of his way to have like really meaningful conversations about how you're doing. I remember him. I think I mentioned before. He drove me out. I forgot my wallet at a high school.
Who is this?
Once.
Your coach?
Yeah, one of my coaches. And he, after the bus got back and we got back to the locker room, whatever, I thought, oh, I forgot my wallet. And so what did he do? He's married and has little kids, but he took me in his truck and we drove all the way back out to this place, which is 45 minutes away. got my wallet, and came back. And we just had this long conversation in there the whole time. And I'm like, this can't be enjoyable for him. You know, like, why is he doing this? And it's just like, well, he cared to mentor a young guy who, and asked me all sorts of interesting, like, important questions at that time. I can remember that whole conversation. And it's like, it doesn't have to do that. Inconveniencing himself to help somebody else out who's in need. And that kind of personal investment, people remember, and it makes a difference. At the end of the day, like, what kind of trophies you have, or what kind of records you have, or what kind of, like, who cares? For all eternity, though, people who personally invested in you, that you remember. So, all right. Closing thoughts for Samuel, anything?
Nope.
Okay. Would you like to close, or would you like me to close?
Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this time that we get to spend exploring maybe some of the less frequented parts of the Bible. And please, I know we have prayed this before, but help us to remember that these events actually took place and that they are applicable to us today, things that we can learn from them, and ultimately how they all point to Jesus as our own personal Savior. And please be with us as we go into this week. As I'm entering into my last week of school and then taking boards, please give me a peace that only you can give, a confidence in how you've prepared me, and all of the opportunities that you've given me, and just an otherworldly strength to get through a stressful time with a calm and Christ-like demeanor. So as we take a week off, please help us to remember that we're not taking a week off from studying your word. Please help us to be always prioritizing prayer and study and community with other Christians and fellowship, because those are the most important things, the things that are going to make us, the things that are actually going to matter and give us character and build us up in this world. Amen.
No. Thanks again for studying with us. We will see you again. As Aid said, 1 week off, and then we're going to be coming back in 2 weeks. If you're looking for more material, we got a couple hundred episodes in the archives, so feel free to jump back and then join us when we start back up in 2 weeks. All right, thanks for studying. We'll see you next time.